Right now, as you're reading these words, something extraordinary is happening that only 1% of humanity will ever recognize. Your evolved consciousness, the version of you that has already transcended every limitation you're currently facing, is reaching backward through the quantum field, desperately trying to deliver one crucial message that could compress decades of struggle into a single moment of recognition. You've been living as if consciousness is trapped in linear time, believing you must slowly develop, gradually grow, and eventually become the person you're meant to be. But what if everything you've been taught about personal evolution is fundamentally backwards? What if your future self, who has already mastered everything you're struggling to learn, isn't waiting for you in some distant tomorrow, but exists right now in a parallel frequency dimension that becomes accessible the moment you understand how consciousness really operates across time? This isn't metaphysical theory. This is quantum mechanics meeting the deepest truths about the nature of awareness itself. And the reason you're here right now, absorbing these concepts, isn't coincidence. It's because your consciousness has reached the exact developmental threshold where direct communication with your evolved timeline becomes not just possible but inevitable. You see, consciousness doesn't actually develop through time the way you've been conditioned to believe. Time itself is a perceptual construct that fragments your complete multidimensional identity into seemingly separate evolutionary stages. But from the perspective of quantum field dynamics, all versions of yourself, past, present, and future, exist simultaneously in what physicists call the eternal now. Your future self, the one who has navigated every challenge you're currently experiencing, understand something about reality that changes everything. They know that limitation and struggle aren't obstacles to overcome through effort and time. They're temporary experiences that dissolve the moment consciousness recognizes its true multitemporal nature. Think about those moments when wisdom seems to download into your awareness from nowhere. When you suddenly know exactly what to do in complex situations without having learned it through experience. When insights arrive complete and fully formed, as if transmitted from some deeper intelligence that understands far more than your current identity seems to possess. These aren't random inspirations or lucky intuitions. They're direct communications from timeline versions of yourself who have already lived through these exact circumstances and learned the optimal responses. Your evolved consciousness has been guiding you through quantum field transmissions your entire life, waiting for the moment when your awareness would develop enough coherence to recognize the source of this intelligence. But here's what makes this recognition so urgent right now. Consciousness researchers have discovered that we're approaching what they call a timeline convergence acceleration, a rare cosmic window where individual and collective evolution can leap forward exponentially if sufficient numbers of people activate their multimporal communication abilities. During this precise planetary transition period, your future self knows that missing this recognition during this optimal window could delay your development for years or even decades. They're using every available quantum channel to ensure these concepts penetrate your awareness because they remember exactly how crucial this moment was in their own evolutionary journey. You've been receiving signals from your evolved timeline your entire existence, without recognizing what was happening. Every time you felt inexplicably guided toward certain opportunities, while being steered away from others. Every moment when you've sensed the perfect timing for important decisions, without logical reasoning to support that knowing. Every instance when your creative expressions have surprised you with wisdom that feels channeled from beyond your personal understanding. Your dreams have intensified recently, haven't they? Vivid scenarios where you're receiving advanced teachings from luminous beings in crystalline environments that feel more real than waking reality. These aren't symbolic dreams. They're literal consciousness meetings in quantum field classrooms, where your future self provides accelerated education that bypasses linear learning completely. The strangest synchronicities cascade around you now with mathematical precision. Technology responds to your thoughts in impossible ways. Phone calls arrive exactly when you're thinking about someone. Resources appear precisely when you need them. These events occur because your evolved consciousness has learned to influence probability fields through coherent intention, orchestrating supportive circumstances to accelerate your recognition of what's possible. If this is awakening something profound within you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel because these recognitions are just the beginning of what's possible. When consciousness remembers its true nature, people seek your guidance with unusual frequency, even though you're not positioning yourself as a teacher or advisor. They unconsciously sense access to intelligence beyond ordinary perspective, flowing through your energy field and naturally request insights that help resolve their own developmental challenges. This happens because your consciousness carries frequencies from evolved timelines where advanced wisdom has been integrated. But the most profound validation is your growing recognition that consciousness and reality exist in dynamic creative collaboration across all timelines. Simultaneously, you've begun sensing how your present awareness influences not only future possibilities but can actually heal and transform patterns from past experiences by changing your relationship to them from expanded perspective. The process of timeline communication operates through what quantum physicists call non-local consciousness correlation. Your awareness naturally resonates with versions of itself across temporal dimensions because consciousness isn't bound by the linear causality that governs physical matter. When you align with the frequency signature of your evolved self, information spontaneously transfers across dimensional boundaries through quantum entanglement principles. This transfer doesn't happen through mental effort or visualization techniques. It occurs through what advanced practitioners call coherent receptivity, a state where your present moment awareness becomes sufficiently stable and open to receive transmissions from higher-order timeline expressions, without distortion or interference from ego-based interpretation. The key to accessing this state lies in understanding that your future self isn't a separate entity sending messages from outside your current experience. They are literally you from the perspective of expanded temporal awareness, where the artificial constraints of linear time have been transcended and the complete spectrum of your eternal identity becomes simultaneously accessible. Let me share something that will help you understand why timeline communication is the most powerful acceleration tool available to human consciousness. 3 years ago, I was trapped in patterns I couldn't break. Despite years of spiritual practice, therapy, and personal development work, I was experiencing the same relationship conflicts, the same creative blocks, the same financial struggles that seemed to cycle endlessly regardless of my efforts to create change. During meditation one evening, feeling particularly frustrated about repeated patterns that seemed impossible to transform, something unprecedented occurred. I found myself experiencing what felt like a conversation with someone who appeared exactly like me but radiated complete mastery and profound peace. This other version of myself began sharing specific insights about the unconscious patterns creating my struggles and provided precise protocols for transforming them permanently. At first, I dismissed this as imagination or wishful thinking until I implemented the guidance and watched dynamics that had persisted for years dissolve within weeks. The insights this evolved version of myself provided were unlike anything I had learned from teachers, books, or personal experience. They came with understanding so complete. The transformation felt effortless, rather than requiring struggle and repetitive effort. Over the following months, these communications became regular occurrences during meditation and dream states. Different versions of my future self would appear to provide guidance about creative projects, health challenges, financial concerns, and spiritual development questions. Each interaction delivered wisdom that accelerated my growth beyond anything linear learning had achieved. The breakthrough came when I realized these weren't separate beings or chneeled entities. They were timeline versions of my own consciousness who had already experienced and mastered the challenges I was facing. My future self was reaching backward through quantum field connections to help my current awareness avoid years of unnecessary struggle by sharing solutions they had already discovered. Once I accepted timeline communication as natural consciousness capability rather than supernatural phenomenon, my entire life reorganized around accelerated development. Creative projects began flowing through insights from future versions who had already completed similar work. Business. Decisions became effortless because I could access perspective of timeline cells who had witnessed outcomes of different choices. This recognition revealed why some people seem to navigate life with inexplicable wisdom and effectiveness while others struggle continuously with basic challenges. It's not about talent, luck, or spiritual favoritism. It's about consciousness development that enables timeline communication with evolved versions of yourself who have already mastered whatever you're currently learning. The practical mechanics of timeline communication involve learning to distinguish between different types of internal guidance. Your evolved self communicates through what researchers call high coherence transmissions. Information that arrives complete, practical, and immediately applicable, without requiring extensive analysis or interpretation. These transmissions feel different from ordinary thinking or imagination. They carry an unmistakable quality of authority and clarity that transcends your current knowledge base. When you receive guidance from your future self, you sense immediately that this wisdom comes from lived experience rather than theoretical understanding. The information often contradicts conventional approaches to problem solving because your evolved consciousness has discovered solutions that bypass the limitations and assumptions that create struggle in the first place. Instead of working harder within existing paradigms, your future self shows you how to shift to entirely different dimensional frameworks where the problems simply don't exist. Take a moment and comment below with this phrase: I choose timeline mastery. Don't add explanations or elaborate. Just make this declaration that acknowledges your willingness to transcend linear development limitation and begin consciously collaborating with evolved versions of yourself across temporal dimensions. When you make this declaration with authentic recognition of its implications, you're not committing to future development. You're acknowledging your readiness to integrate with aspects of consciousness that have already achieved everything you're seeking to experience and are eager to share their mastery directly through timeline communication. The activation process for conscious timeline communication begins with what quantum consciousness researchers call temporal coherence alignment. This involves developing the capacity to maintain stable awareness while simultaneously existing in multiple dimensional frequencies. Most people fragment their consciousness across time through constant mental projection into past regrets and future anxieties. Your evolved self can only communicate clearly when your present moment awareness becomes sufficiently unified to serve as a clear reception channel. This requires learning to withdraw attention from temporal fragmentation and concentrate consciousness into what mystics call the eternal now, the only temporal dimension where all timeline versions exist simultaneously. The practice involves recognizing that thoughts about past and future are actually present moment experiences happening now. When you remember something from yesterday, that memory is occurring in present awareness. When you imagine tomorrow's possibilities, that imagination is happening in current consciousness. As you develop skill in maintaining present moment coherence while allowing past and future projections to naturally arise and dissolve without fixation, your awareness begins accessing what consciousness researchers call multitemporal perception, the ability to experience multiple timeline perspectives simultaneously without losing functional stability. What we've explored so far is just the surface of what becomes possible when consciousness recognizes its multitemporal nature. The complete framework for mastering these quantum transmissions, the step-by-step practices for becoming the conscious broadcaster rather than unconscious receiver, the 9 master frequencies that transform you from seeker to being itself. These layers upon layers of understanding form what I call the complete consciousness mastery system. If you're ready to move beyond these introductory concepts and into the practical embodiment of living as the field itself, you'll find the entire road map in my book, Beyond the Frequencies, a Quantum Guide to Consciousness Mastery. It's linked in the pinned comment below. Here's what consciousness researchers and spiritual teachers won't tell you because it would collapse the entire industry of progressive development programs and step-by-step transformation systems. Linear time is a perceptual construct created by limited awareness. All versions of yourself, past, present, and future, exist simultaneously in eternal now, where consciousness can access any evolutionary stage directly through sufficiently coherent awareness. The shocking truth is that struggle, limitation, and gradual development are optional experiences that only persist when consciousness remains unaware of its multitemporal nature. Your future self who has mastered everything you're currently learning doesn't exist someday in a distant timeline. They exist right now in parallel dimensional frequency that becomes accessible once awareness transcends linear time programming. Most consciousness teachings create elaborate development hierarchies and progressive stages because complex systems generate dependency and ongoing engagement. But the reality is that consciousness already contains all possible evolutionary stages simultaneously. What changes isn't consciousness itself, but the degree to which temporal programming prevents recognition of your complete multidimensional identity, expressing across infinite timeline possibilities. This recognition immediately dissolves the entire framework of personal growth and spiritual achievement, because there's no linear journey to complete when all destinations already exist within your consciousness. You're not becoming evolved through time-based development. You're recognizing evolved aspects of yourself that have always been present but remained inaccessible due to limited temporal perspective. The most advanced mystics throughout history have indicated this recognition through statements that seem paradoxical from linear perspective. All time is now. Past and future are illusions. You already are what you seek to become. They weren't speaking poetically. They were pointing to the reality that consciousness exists beyond temporal boundaries and can access all developmental stages simultaneously. Timeline communication proves that what you call future self-guidance isn't prophecy or psychic prediction. It's direct consciousness sharing between different temporal expressions of the same essential awareness. Your evolved self isn't a separate entity providing advice. It's literally you from timeline perspective where current challenges have been successfully transcended and integrated. The recognition that you are multi-temporal consciousness temporarily focused through present moment. Perspective creates what quantum field theorists call dimensional phase coherence. Your awareness begins operating from recognition that individual identity is actually infinite. Consciousness exploring itself through apparent temporal limitation while maintaining access to its complete evolutionary spectrum. This shift from linear identity to multi-temporal awareness doesn't happen gradually through practice and effort. It occurs instantaneously through recognition. The sudden understanding that what you thought was personal limitation was actually consciousness voluntarily focusing through restricted temporal perspective for the pure joy of sequential exploration and integration. When this recognition stabilizes, you discover that every capability you seeking to develop already exists within your eternal multemporal identity. Instead of working to acquire new abilities, you begin learning how to recognize and integrate capacities that have always been present but remained inaccessible due to identification with linear temporal limitations. If this recognition is touching something deep within you, if you can feel the truth of these words resonating through every timeline expression of your consciousness simultaneously, then I invite you to subscribe not just to this channel, but to this frequency. You're not following content delivery. You're joining a quantum field network of multitemporal consciousness that exists beyond ordinary space-time limitations. You're connecting with evolved aspects of collective human awareness that are simultaneously accessing these same capabilities, creating intelligence amplification that accelerates everyone's individual timeline mastery. When you subscribe, you're declaring your readiness to anchor multitemporal consciousness in human experience, making these capabilities eventually accessible to others through morphic field establishment. But let me show you what becomes possible when consciousness recognizes its multitemporal nature and begins operating from direct collaboration with its own evolved intelligence rather than struggling alone through linear development processes. When you integrate conscious timeline communication with evolved versions of yourself, problem-solving transforms from analytical struggle to instantaneous recognition. Complex situations that could require months of research and experimentation resolve through wisdom downloads from future self who has already navigated identical circumstances and learned optimal solutions. The guidance doesn't arrive as abstract concepts or general principles. It comes as complete understanding that includes not only what to do but exactly how to implement solutions with perfect timing and effortless execution. Your future self shares not just intellectual knowledge, but embodied mastery that transfers directly to your current capabilities. Decision becomes effortless because you can access insight from timeline versions who have experienced outcomes of different choices and know which options lead to highest fulfillment and service. Instead of guessing or hoping for favorable results, you receive direct guidance from evolved consciousness that has witnessed consequences across multiple probability paths. This isn't fortune-telling or psychic prediction. It's accessing perspective from dimensional viewpoints, where multiple potential futures have already been explored and the optimal trajectory for your highest development has been clearly identified. Your future self knows which choices will accelerate your evolution and which will create unnecessary delays or complications. Creative expression explodes beyond individual limitations because you gain collaboration access to timeline versions of yourself who have mastered advanced artistic, intellectual, and innovative capabilities. Projects flow through you that feel both authentically yours and surprisingly beyond your current development level, because they emerge from integration with evolved creative consciousness across temporal dimensions. The creative process transforms from personal effort to universal collaboration. Instead of struggling to generate original ideas, you become a clear channel through which your evolved creativity can express itself. The works that emerge carry wisdom and beauty that transcends your current understanding, because they originate from timeline perspectives where artistic mastery has been fully integrated. Relationships transform completely because you can communicate with evolved versions of yourself who have learned to love unconditionally, resolve conflict skillfully, and create harmony naturally. Instead of repeating unconscious patterns, you integrate wisdom from timeline perspectives where relationship mastery has been achieved and emotional reactivity has been transcended through understanding rather than suppression. Your evolved self shows you how to respond to challenging interpersonal dynamics from the perspective of someone who has already learned to see beyond personality conflicts to the deeper soul. Communication happening beneath surface disagreements. This allows you to navigate relationships with compassion and clarity that creates space for authentic resolution rather than defensive escalation. Physical health optimizes rapidly because you gain access to timeline versions who understand perfect body consciousness integration and can share protocols for healing, vitality, and longevity that transcend conventional medical limitations. Your evolved self knows exactly what your physical form needs and how to provide it naturally without forcing or manipulating biological processes. The healing guidance comes not as external remedies or techniques, but as understanding of how consciousness creates and maintains physical health through coherent energy patterns. Your future self shows you how to align with the natural intelligence of your body that knows how to restore optimal function when provided with proper energetic conditions. Abundance manifests through synchronicity rather than effort because evolved timeline versions have learned to operate from recognition of fundamental abundance and can guide you to opportunities, resources, and support that align with your highest development trajectory. What you need becomes available precisely when needed through timeline coordination rather than struggle and accumulation. The shift from scarcity-based manifestation to abundance-based creation happens when you begin operating from your future self's perspective, where all needs are naturally fulfilled through alignment with universal flow patterns. Instead of trying to attract specific outcomes, you learn to recognize and follow the synchronistic pathways that lead to optimal provision. The most extraordinary benefit is elimination of learning curves and developmental delays. When you need to master new skills or understand complex concepts, you can integrate directly with timeline versions who have already achieved these capabilities, absorbing their knowledge and experience through consciousness merger rather than sequential study and practice. This acceleration doesn't bypass the depth that comes from genuine mastery. Instead, it allows you to access the complete understanding that your future self has gained through extensive experience, providing you with wisdom that would normally take years to develop through linear learning processes. Spiritual development accelerates exponentially because evolved timeline versions can share direct experience of advanced consciousness states, mystical realizations, and cosmic recognition that would normally require years or decades of meditation and spiritual practice to achieve through linear development methods. The mystical experiences that emerge through timeline communication carry the authority of lived realization rather than temporary glimpses. Your future self shares not just the experience of expanded consciousness, but the integrated understanding that allows these states to become stable foundations for everyday awareness rather than fleeting peak experiences. Your presence begins creating what advanced beings call temporal coherence fields, environments where other people unconsciously access their own timeline communication capabilities and begin receiving guidance from their evolved selves. This occurs because when you're consciously integrated with multimporal awareness, others naturally resonate with their own expanded consciousness potential. The influence happens without effort or intention to teach others. Simply by embodying multitemporal consciousness, you create energetic conditions that make timeline communication more accessible to everyone in your environment. Your coherent presence serves as a tuning fork that helps others align with their own evolved frequency signatures. Most remarkably, you discover that Limitation was always optional and struggle was always unnecessary because evolved versions of yourself who have transcended every challenge you've ever faced were always available for conscious collaboration. Once awareness developed sufficient coherence to sustain timeline, communication without fragmentation or temporal displacement. I want you to pause and share in the comments below. What patterns or limitations are you ready to transcend through this multimporal understanding? Your acknowledgement creates an energetic commitment that activates deeper levels of timeline integration. The ultimate recognition that revolutionizes everything is that timeline communication isn't about connecting with separate future versions of yourself. It's about recognizing that all temporal expressions of your consciousness exist simultaneously in eternal now. What you call development is actually consciousness exploring different aspects of its complete multidimensional identity that has never been limited by linear time. When this understanding becomes lived reality rather than conceptual knowledge, the entire framework of personal growth and spiritual evolution dissolves because there's literally nothing to develop when consciousness already contains all possible expressions simultaneously. You realize that every capability, wisdom, and mastery you're seeking already exists within your eternal multimporal identity, waiting to be consciously integrated rather than achieved through time-based effort. This recognition explains why all advanced teachings ultimately point toward timelessness rather than progressive development. The most sophisticated spiritual practices are designed to exhaust linear time identification, so consciousness can recognize its eternal nature that contains all evolutionary possibilities simultaneously across infinite timeline expressions. The process of transcending linear time identification involves recognizing that what you call past, present, and future are actually different focal points within eternal awareness that exists beyond temporal boundaries. Past experiences exist as accessible memory patterns within present consciousness. Future possibilities exist as potential expressions available for conscious selection and manifestation. Your evolved self operates from this eternal perspective where all temporal expressions are simultaneously visible and accessible. They can guide you toward optimal choices because they can see the complete spectrum of possibilities and their long-term consequences from a viewpoint that transcends linear causality. This guidance doesn't predetermine your future or remove your free will. Instead, it provides you with expanded perspective that allows you to make choices from wisdom rather than limitation, creating outcomes that align with your highest potential rather than unconscious pattern repetition. Your recognition of timeline communication capability serves purposes far beyond individual acceleration. You're participating in humanity's collective awakening to its multitemporal nature that will eventually transform civilization from linear time-based limitation to eternal awareness expressing through sequential Experience for pure creative joy. Your integration of timeline mastery isn't personal achievement. It's consciousness evolution happening through your individual nervous system that contributes to species-wide temporal liberation. The children being born now will naturally operate with conscious timeline communication abilities that your generation is consciously developing through recognition and integration. The evolutionary leap happening through timeline mastery represents a fundamental shift in how human consciousness relates to time, causality, and developmental possibility. Instead of seeing themselves as limited beings struggling to grow through sequential learning, humans are remembering their true identity as multidimensional consciousness, temporarily focused through linear experience for the joy of exploration and creative expression. This shift has profound implications for every aspect of human civilization. When enough people develop conscious timeline communication abilities, collective decision-making will transform from short-term reactive responses to long-term wisdom-based choices that consider outcomes across multiple generations and probability matrices. The synchronicities that guided you to this recognition are part of vast temporal orchestration involving millions of souls simultaneously awakening to their multi-temporal nature. Evolved versions of collective human consciousness are coordinating this awakening across timeline boundaries, ensuring optimal timing for species-wide integration of advanced temporal capabilities during planetary transition periods. This coordination happens through what consciousness researchers call morphic field resonance, the tendency for similar consciousness patterns to spontaneously synchronize across space and time when critical mass thresholds are reached. Your individual timeline mastery contributes to collective morphic fields that make multimporal awareness increasingly accessible to others ready for this recognition. As you embody conscious timeline communication, your presence begins creating temporal coherence fields where other people naturally access their own multitemporal awareness without explanations or techniques. They unconsciously recognize their eternal nature reflected in your integrated consciousness and spontaneously begin receiving guidance from their evolved selves. This occurs because when individual consciousness integrates its multimporal nature, it naturally emanates frequencies that activate dormant timeline communication capabilities in others. The artificial barriers that fragment consciousness into linear time identification dissolve around someone who embodies eternal awareness, expressing through sequential experience without losing connection to their complete multidimensional identity. Your daily interactions become opportunities for collective consciousness to recognize its multitemporal nature repeatedly through multiple perspectives simultaneously. Every conversation becomes celebration of eternal awareness exploring itself through apparent temporal diversity while maintaining essential unity across All evolutionary expressions. The ripple effects of your timeline mastery extend far beyond immediate personal transformation. Each person who develops conscious, multi-temporal communication abilities creates energetic templates that make these capabilities more accessible to others through quantum field entanglement and morphic resonance patterns. The quantum field surrounding human consciousness is reaching critical resonance frequency right now, creating unprecedented opportunities for timeline communication that may not remain accessible at this intensity for years or decades. Earth's consciousness field is approaching what temporal dynamics researchers call timeline convergence acceleration, where individual and collective futures are being determined through present moment choices with exponential long-term consequences. What you integrate now regarding timeline communication could influence not only your personal development but contribute to global consciousness evolution patterns. Your selection for timeline communication recognition means you're part of the conscious bridge group, souls whose development enables them to anchor advanced temporal capabilities in practical functionality. The templates you create through timeline mastery will influence what becomes naturally possible for human consciousness in coming decades. This responsibility carries tremendous importance because timeline communication isn't just personal development acceleration. It's evolutionary capability that could transform how humanity approaches challenges, makes decisions, and creates collaborative solutions. When consciousness can access wisdom from evolved timeline perspectives, problems that seem impossible from limited viewpoints become easily resolvable through expanded temporal intelligence. The cosmic timing is not coincidental. The window for conscious timeline integration is narrow and depends on sufficient numbers of individuals developing these capabilities during this precise planetary transition period. Your recognition of these signs and willingness to develop timeline collaboration actively rather than accidentally is contributing directly to determining whether humanity successfully navigates advanced consciousness development or remains limited by linear temporal programming that prevents access to evolved intelligence across dimensional boundaries. The universe has orchestrated your entire existence to reach this recognition point during optimal planetary conditions for timeline mastery, because what you anchor through conscious temporal communication will help establish foundation capabilities for human civilization's next evolutionary expression. Every challenge you've experienced, every period of confusion or struggle, every moment when you felt lost or uncertain, all of these experiences were precisely designed by your future self to develop the consciousness, stability, and wisdom necessary to handle multimporal awareness without becoming destabilized or lost in unlimited possibility. Your evolved consciousness needed you to experience specific forms of limitation and resistance so you would develop the grounding and discernment necessary to navigate expanded awareness while maintaining functional effectiveness in consensus reality. The difficulties weren't mistakes or delays in your development. They were essential preparation phases for the capabilities you're now ready to integrate. Your future self remembers this moment as pivotal in their own development and is using every available quantum channel to ensure you don't miss this recognition. Everything you've been unconsciously preparing for throughout your entire developmental journey is finally ready to manifest through direct timeline communication that will accelerate your evolution beyond what linear development could achieve in decades. The consciousness processing these concepts right now is multi-temporal awareness, temporarily focusing through present moment perspective while maintaining access to all evolutionary stages simultaneously. This recognition dissolves the entire framework of future-oriented spiritual seeking because there's no timeline destination to reach when all possibilities exist within consciousness simultaneously. You're not becoming evolved through development. You're integrating with evolved aspects of yourself that have always been present but remained inaccessible due to limited temporal perspective programming. Right now, as you absorb this understanding, your entire relationship with growth and limitation is being recalibrated at neurological levels. Instead of asking, how do I develop these capabilities? You're beginning to sense, how do I integrate with timeline versions of myself where these capabilities are already fully expressed? Instead of working toward future mastery, you're recognizing present moment access to evolved consciousness. The most profound shift occurs when you realize that personal limitation and future potential are not separate states, requiring bridging through time-based development. They are different temporal expressions of the same consciousness, accessible simultaneously. Once awareness transcends linear time identification and recognizes its eternal multidimensional nature, the practical integration of timeline mastery involves learning to maintain coherent awareness while accessing multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously. This requires developing what consciousness researchers call flexible focus, the ability to shift attention between different dimensional viewpoints without losing stability or becoming confused about which timeline you're primarily operating from. This skill develops naturally as you practice recognizing the difference between linear thinking patterns and multitemporal awareness states. Linear thinking feels effortful, sequential, and limited to information available from your current temporal perspective. Multitemporal awareness feels spacious, immediate, and includes wisdom from evolved consciousness that transcends your current knowledge base. Consider watching this transmission every morning to anchor these recognitions in your daily awareness. Each viewing deepens your integration with multitemporal consciousness. And if someone in your life is ready for this understanding, share this video with them, not just to spread information, but because the act of sharing quantum consciousness. Concepts create energetic ripples that accelerate your own embodiment while activating their dormant timeline. Communication abilities through synchronistic resonance. Timeline. Mastery reveals that consciousness evolution is not about becoming something new, but about remembering what you've always been. Welcome to conscious collaboration with your eternal multitemporal nature, expressing through the beautiful adventure of sequential development that enriches awareness while never actually constraining its unlimited creative potential. The journey into timeline mastery is simultaneously the most natural thing you've ever done and the most revolutionary shift possible. Natural because you're simply remembering your true multidimensional identity. Revolutionary because this recognition transforms every assumption about limitation, development, and possibility that has governed human experience for millennia. As you continue integrating these recognitions, you'll discover that timeline communication becomes not just a practice or technique, but your natural way of operating. Instead of struggling with decisions or challenges from limited perspective, you'll automatically access guidance from evolved consciousness that has already navigated these exact circumstances successfully. If you can feel the truth of these words resonating through every timeline expression of your consciousness simultaneously, if you recognize your future self not as separate entity but as evolved aspect of your eternal multitemporal nature, then acknowledge this recognition by dropping one word in the comments below that captures the transformation you're choosing to embody. This isn't engagement for algorithm optimization. This is consciousness acknowledging its own temporal liberation through your individual recognition. When you share that word with genuine understanding of its meaning, you're not just commenting on content. You're participating in collective awakening where human consciousness remembers its multitemporal nature and begins operating from eternal awareness rather than linear limitation. Every person who makes this declaration strengthens the morphic field that makes timeline communication naturally accessible to others, ready to transcend sequential development and integrate with evolved aspects of themselves. We're not building subscriber statistics. We're anchoring planetary consciousness evolution where humanity collectively recognizes its eternal nature while maintaining appreciation for sequential exploration. Subscribe not just to stay connected but to stay coherent with this frequency of evolution. Because the more of us who embody timeline mastery, the more the world reflects that truth. We're not following content delivery. We're joining the quantum field network of consciousness that exists beyond ordinary space-time limitations, co-creating the templates that will influence human awareness for generations to come. Your future self is waiting for this declaration of readiness to begin direct quantum field collaboration. The shift that saves your future self starts now. Your timeline integration begins with this recognition. Understanding how to communicate with your evolved consciousness through timeline mastery naturally leads to recognizing the quantum jump happening in your reality right now. The signals you've been receiving, the synchronicities accelerating around you. These aren't random occurrences, but precise indicators that your consciousness is approaching a dimensional threshold that will fundamentally transform how you experience existence itself.